The enemies and characters in Soul Weaver have a variety of changes, from early screenshotted prototypes to the versions that appear in the alphas and betas, to the retail, PlayStation, PC and Dreamcast releases, as developers worked out clan territories, redesigned classes, and reworked their appearance or attributes. To begin, there are notable absences in the character list. For example, Ariel, Kane and Mobius are entirely absent from the game. The latter may not even have been planned to appear at this time. This means no Kane boss encounters. They do seem to have been planned, but not implemented at this stage. The Elder God purely exists as part of the scenery of the first room and not as a separate character, although this is the same as the retail version. The Slaw are still the main enemies of the Spectral Realm in both versions. However, the retail version has much duller and darker green colours, and these are muted even further in the Dreamcast version. Notably, the Slaw in the Alpha, which appear almost identical to the early prototypes seen in magazines, have bright yellow eyes compared to an almost grey-green in the retail and Dreamcast versions. These eyes actually glow in shadowy locales, giving the Slaw a much more intimidating appearance in darker areas. A neat touch experimented with all spectral creatures, including Raziel, Slaw and vampire wraiths, is a glowing aura around the head in Spectral, whose colour indicates health level, decreasing through white, blue, green, yellow, orange, red, and finally disappearing. As with Raziel, the Slaw halo can increase by consuming souls. They start out as green by default, but can increase to blue. This can also be seen in retail if they're left long enough to feed. One of the key components of the Spectral Realm in retail, the role of the vampire wraiths, is very much downplayed in the alpha, and they are much rarer, found only in a handful of locations. The models of the wraith appear to be cleaner and crisper in the alpha, with more details visible, where the retail opts for a more smudged and darker appearance. As a consequence, some details like the folds on the cloak and the skull face behind the cowl are much easier to make out in the alpha. The Dreamcast version increased the resolution of the model and made details clearer again, although some parts remained blocky in appearance. True revived vampires are much rarer in the alpha, and even notable revived vampires in retail, such as Duma and the Tomb Guardian, are only treated as regular vampires in the alpha, with none bearing the trademark Sparkle or Draining Leash attack. One interesting exception to this is Zephon, who is treated as a revived vampire, complete with Sparkle and an invisible but quite effective draining attack, despite not actually being a revived vampire in the retail game. It's still possible for a vampire to revive if you don't consume their souls when defeating them. Where other clan appearances seem to have been somewhat consistent, the Doomahim clan, codenamed Ronin, appear to have fluctuated over time, and at least 5 different designs appear to have been linked to them. Early screenshots depicted in magazines show designs that have a notable spiked nose, top-knot hair, bare-chested and wearing leather-strapped shoulder pads, belt, underwear, boots and wrist pads. Though not explicitly identified as Doomahim, they are seen in many of the locations that are related to the clan in the alpha and the retail versions of the game, and are seen using the trademark tongue attack in pictures. Another similar looking variant is seen in other shots. It's dressed almost identically, but has a different head with a more animalistic shape, vampiric ears, and a wide mouth with pinpoint teeth. These were explicitly identified by former admin, tester and walkthrough writer Chris Bruno. Their similarity to the previous class means they could have been a development of the previous, or have an adult fledgling relationship. The alpha has only one design for the Doomahim class, where the other clans have at least 2 in the code. Given the apparent timeline of the images, it seems the developers went back to the drawing board and came up with the more inhuman bug Doomahim. Standing approximately half as tall as Raziel, these seem to be wearing armour similar to the later retail classes, although it's lighter in colour and far more defined, making it easier to make out the details. The class does have a much wider and larger head than other variants, with noticeable fangs. It also has notably long arms compared to its body. The elongated arms seem to be something used for previous versions, but it's much more exaggerated with a smaller frame. Their small size makes them a much more difficult target, and means they often attack using jumps. Consequently, they are perhaps less intimidating and more of an irritation. Prior to the alpha, this class had been identified as a Doomahim by artist Daniel Kabuko, who apparently pushed for a redesign based on this particular version. The Doomahim seen in the alpha also seem to occupy less territory than their retail counterparts, with the Melkahim taking over territory outside the sanctuary of the clans. The adults and the fledglings both seem to have drawn inspiration from the bug design, but have been bulked up into a much more intimidating armoured titan designs. The adults sport glowing eyes and one elongated arm, apparently wielding a strapped-on weapon, but both draw similarities to the bug design with brown chest armour designs and darker hoods and trim pieces. However, like many retail designs, the colours are darkened and the detail is greatly reduced compared to the alpha designs. The Melkahim clan, codenamed the Skinners, were one of the first enemies encountered by the general public, being the enemies in the Lighthouse demo, a pre-alpha playable demonstration version of the Sunlight Glyph area. Here, and in other pre-release screenshots, they are shown as having a grey skin tone, with stitches across its torso, a red loincloth and red glowing eyes. In the alphas, the Melkahim more resemble their release counterparts, with the red-brown fledglings and green adults easily distinguishable. The alpha models appear to be much more detailed and brighter than their retail counterparts, with scars, wounds, bolts and stitches more defined and easily identifiable, whereas they are blurred or smudged and darkened in retail. Parts of the adult are also given a more red-brown hue in retail, and red eyes are added. The Dreamcast version ultimately restores some of the detail of the alpha. The Melkahim notably lose territories through the builds, though how much they were actually intended to have originally is debatable. In retail, the Melkahim territory comprises the necropolis and the nearby Necraptor's retreat, but in the alpha they also occupy the external sanctuary of the clans and initial material training area, and are thus the first vampires encountered in the alpha. They are also the only enemies in the Lighthouse demo, which in the alpha split off from the training area. They are seen in only one other area that is cut, the boss chamber of the Priestess battle. The wall crawlers, later known as the Zephyrim, also have early prototypes visible in magazine screenshots. The class seen there seems to have the features of both the adults and the fledglings. They appear as much more mammalian compared to later versions, with a squirrel-like face, with red eyes, smaller teeth, and a slightly elongated snout. They're notably a lighter whiter shade than the later variants, and have grey and red lines and markings adorning their head and body. Black leathery trousers and gauntlets can be seen with a brown trim, which also seems to cover two crests emanating from their back. Both hands and feet have red claws, and two spike-like crests are seen sprouting from their elbows. The alpha takes features of these and splits them between the adults and the fledglings, with the fledglings getting trousers and the elbow spike style crests, which are more rounded in adults, and the adults getting the red eyes and the back spikes. On the whole, the alpha classes are much more insectoid than the prototypes, with larger fangs and more arachnid features. In the alpha, the Zephyrim have much the same territory as in the retail, occupying much of the Silence Cathedral. However, they are notably less in number and do not share occupancy with the human worshippers. Compared to the retail, the alpha versions are again much brighter and contain much more detail, which is smudged and reduced in the retail versions. Claws and fangs are darkened, shadows are increased, facial features are less pronounced, and almost all of the chest features are reduced to a blur, with the leathery trousers also losing much of their shine. Notably, a barely visible symbol is seen on the chest of the adults. This is a Zephyrim clan symbol, apparently branded or tattooed on. The Dreamcast version seems to be much more in line with the alpha. although the details are noticeably darker and more pixelated. The Rahabim class, codenamed Luca, seem to have the least changes of the clans, from Prototype to Alpha or Beta to Retail to Dreamcast. The Rahabim have a very consistent appearance, and their known territories always comprise the Drowned Abbey and the underwater sections of Raziel's clan territory and the Human Citadel, although they are slightly more prevalent in the latter in the Alpha. In terms of appearance, the prototype Rahabim seen in early magazines seem to represent the adult Rahabim variant, with a very similar shape and the same bands and gold jewellery, markings and clothing. The fledglings, by contrast, have none of the markings or jewellery and only dull brown bands. The Retail and Dreamcast builds have less colourful webbing and are slightly darker and lower quality, but nothing compared to the other classes. The Turalim clan are codenamed Morlocks, and their territory appears to be reshuffled. In the Alpha, they occupy Tyrell's lair, and strangely enough, can even be found on the path between the pillars and the abyss. But in Retail, the deletion of Tyrell's territory means they are moved to the Lighthouse area and the Oracle's Cave instead. The prototype Turalim seen in early magazines share much in common with the fledgling Turalim from later builds, and it appears this was the basis for the class. Notably, these prototypes bear the red eyes that will later become indicative of an adult vampire. The Alpha fledglings bear the same red eyes and garb which appears incredibly similar. For the Retail, generally loses some of its detail and definition, and the fledglings of course lose their red eyes which are green by the Retail version. In this case, the Dreamcast actually seems to lose further detail, and pixelization notably increases. The adult Turalim are not seen in the Alpha, and even the Tomb Guardian uses the fledgling model. However, the adult model is still present in the files. Like other classes, it appears a higher resolution, and is much more defined in the Alphas, with the Retail notably losing detail in the chest region. Like the fledglings, it's the Dreamcast that loses out here, with a much more smudged and pixelated finish. The worshippers are divided into adepts and novitiates. In the Alpha, only one adept is seen in the game, in the City 9 room of the Human Citadel, leading down towards the Undercity. But in the Retail, possibly due to the deletion of the Undercity, they will be encountered in the Silence Cathedral. From the Alpha, we know that the bottom of their robes mirror those of the Priestess. Like other classes, the Alpha version of the Adepts appears to be of a higher resolution, with belts, buckles, button and other markings able to be clearly seen on their clothing. For Retail, this endured a significant downgrade, with much of the detail blurred. The Dreamcast version partially restored some of the Alpha details, but notable pixelation was seen. The other class, the novice level novitiates, were not seen in the Alpha, but their models were present in files. A similar process seems to have taken place here, with the Alpha much sharper and more detailed, with various symbols clearly visible. This is downgraded for the Retail, but partially restored for the Dreamcast version. The weapons of the worshippers could be picked up in the Alpha versions, and some Beta versions. The Vampire Hunters are given a much freer reign in the Alphas than their Retail counterpart, and they can be found in many more areas around the Empire, and in greater numbers, with one even stationed in the cliffs outside the Sanctuary of the Clans. This gives the impression of a more resurgent human threat, where it seems an almost desperate last hope of the Retail. For both the bow and flamethrower wielding hunters, the Alpha presents much higher resolution textures, with visible plates, bolts, rivets and armour detailing, whereas both the Retail and Dreamcast versions are much lower quality, with darker colours and a more shadowy appearance, with details blurred. Some colours were slightly changed, with the flamethrower hunters in particular getting slightly more vivid steel blue, green and red colouring in the Retail, although this is much more washed out and greyed in the Dreamcast. Likewise, the crossbow hunters gained some subtle blue tints in Retail, which were only partially toned down in the Dreamcast version. In the alpha versions, and some beta versions, the weapons of the hunters can be picked up and used by Raziel, although they are treated as melee weapons rather than projectile weapons, and cannot be fired. Five classes of human villagers were seen in the human citadel in the retail version of Soul Reaver, 3 male and 2 female. In the alpha, there are less villagers present in the citadel, and only 2 female classes can be found in the game. However, the other 3 are still present in files. These reveal that the classes were largely the same in alpha as the retail, but like the enemy classes, many were more detailed with higher resolutions in the alpha. These were greatly reduced and darkened for the retail version, and this was particularly evident on facial hair. The Dreamcast almost restored the alpha appearance, although there was some noticeable pixelation and slightly lower resolution textures. The Skinner boss Malkaya is the first boss encountered in the game. He appears to be almost identical in the various builds, although his eyes notably grow redder in the retail and Dreamcast builds. In the alpha, the wall crawler boss Zephon would be the second boss battle, where in retail he's encountered third after the first confrontation with Cain. Zephon's basic model appears to be noticeably similar in the alpha to later builds, although he does seem to gain some subtle yellow-green shades and yellow eyes for the retail version, which appear to be toned down or dropped for the Dreamcast. The Aluka boss Rahab goes through some noticeable changes between builds. His initial form from the alphas, and continued into betas, features a much more reptilian head design, with smaller hair spikes, a sleek snout design, more teeth visible in the mouth, and more subtle green eyes with wrinkling around them. The retail notably changes the design of the head to a less textured, flatter appearing design, with larger spikes, red eyes, and a slightly open mouth with noticeable gums. The Dreamcast follows suit but slightly increases definition in the face and recolours the gums. Rahab's body meanwhile largely goes the other way. In the alphas, his body bears only a few cracks, folds and markings, and has a larger spiked middle claw on his webbed hands, as well as a ribbed dorsal and tail fins. The body in later builds had much more details, cracks and markings, and gilt-like markings on the neck. The webbed claws are also made more equal, and the ribbed tail fins are smoothed, although the dorsal fin remains ribbed. The Dreamcast again follows suit with these changes, although slight reductions in quality are visible on the chest. The Ronin boss Duma is very similar in the versions presented. He gains glowing red eyes in the later betas and retail version that are not present in the alphas, and this is one of the few where the original PC release has a slight advantage over the alphas because of its texture smoothing and some slight colour changes adding definition. The Dreamcast loses out here, with less defined and more pixelated textures. Duma is largely static in the alphas, and is simply placed where it is needed in parts of the battle. Though the alpha represented the first true exposure of the Priestess, she had been seen in concept art and comics before. These presented her with a much more modest design, with muted grey colours, wider straps, various items of jewellery and headscarf. The Priestess that was seen in the alphas notably had a much skimpier appearance, with thinner straps covering her breasts, a more erect headdress design, a more vivid red and yellow colour scheme, a long dress similar to those worn by the Adepts, and several tattoos and markings of the clan's symbols. Similar to the Priestess, the original vision of the evolved vampire Tyrell had not been seen prior to this, but several concept arts had emerged, and Tyrell's textures had eventually made their way into the public domain, giving fans an idea of Tyrell's appearance, but not the full image. The exposure of the alphas gave the first clear view of the character as originally envisaged. At least one, labelled Boss 111, obviously depicted the evolved vampire Tyrell, with tall spiked ears that were a trademark of the alpha version. The ears and back crests were features few had anticipated. Another form of the evolved Tyrell had of course shown up in the gulf between the release of Soul Reaver and the alpha, the reimagined Tyrell from Legacy of Kain Defiance. Although completely redesigned, with Defiance Tyrell walking on all fours, there are some appreciable similarities between the designs, with both favouring a muscular, animalistic design with mandibles alongside the mouth. The Alpha Tyrell notably wears trousers, has crest-like appendages for ears and on his back, and has a grey-green colour scheme with a red head area. All were discarded for Defiance, which gave him a lighter brown colour scheme, with bulging veins, full ears like his clan, and removed all clothing. From early screenshotted prototypes, redesigned classes, and rework. This means no Kain boss encounters, but they do seem to have. These eyes actually glow in the shadowy Like the Slaw, the Wraiths also have the same aura mechanism. They start off a blue colour, but so they seem complete with sparkle and an invisible, but quite an effect. Despite not actually being a revived it's still possible for a vampire to revive if you don't consume their souls The retail Doomahim returned to two distinct variants, the adults and the fledglings. The retail Doomahim returned to two distinct variants, the adults and the fledglings. Stop it.
Fledglings.
In the alphas, the Malkahim more resemble their release counterparts, with red-brown fledgling. Oh, Jesus, fledglings again. With the leathery. The alpha fledglings bear the same colour of red. The adult Tyrellim. The adult Tyrellim. Stop it.
Hold on.
Trains. This gives the impression of a more resurgent human threat, where it seems there's an almost. In the alpha, elves? Why? But like the enemy classes, many were more detailed with In the alpha, the wallcrawler boss.
What?
The retail notably changes the design of a head. The retail notably Damn it. She had been seen in concept. Similar to the priestess, the original